Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Two reporters. Start now.
Hi, Danny. How you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. Our guest is going to tell us about the violent campaign he's been watching and documenting on the West Bank. He's documenting how Israeli Jewish settlers keep attacking Palestinian Arabs and their families over and over again to drive them out of their villages and off their land. The settlers have been ramping up those attacks over just the past 3 years, and Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government are actively supporting them.
Jewish settlers have been cutting water pipes to Palestinian farmers' fields, uprooting olive groves, physically blocking Palestinian farmers from getting access to the land they've worked for decades. They've gone into houses at night. They've harassed people and terrified them. Gangs of settlers have been beating up unarmed Palestinians and have killed some.
Here's a news clip.
Brandishing his gun wildly, an extremist Israeli settler faces off with Palestinian villagers. He opens fire with deadly consequences. Eyewitnesses, backed by comprehensive video evidence, say he's the only one who's armed. Villagers rush desperately towards him.
With no real punishment being meted out by the Israeli authorities for these murders.
And the Israeli settlers are doing this on territory that would, in theory, become a Palestinian state, a Palestinian country, right?
Yes, if the two sides could agree to it, which, doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon.
Well, let's welcome our guest now, Dror Etkes. Thanks for joining us from Israel.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, you're one of the key researchers who's been documenting these attacks for years now. I first started reading about you in the New York Times and Le Monde in France and The Guardian in the UK. Can you please describe a recent incident?
Yes, I can. Actually, we can go back to few hours back to what happened today in the northern West Bank, next to a village called Ya'bed. This village, actually, most of the Palestinian villages have some families who are living a bit remote from the center of the village. Yeah. Now, I'm jumping to what happened a few weeks ago. About 1 kilometer away, a new outpost was established.
An Israeli settlers outpost. And what the settlers do?
Settlers usually, when they decide that they want to get rid of a family, so they reach the place and start threatening, assaulting, and basically demanding the people to leave the place. It became more and more dangerous for Palestinians to remain living there.
And I just read that a few months ago, there was an attack on another Palestinian village where the settlers wore masks. They pulled people out of their homes. They beat some of the men and I think children up while they were lying on the ground, piled bodies on top of each other in front of everybody else.
Yeah. And then eventually the attacks on this family had become too much. And it was clear that the Israeli military, which is present just a few hundred meters away from this place, is not going to intervene and it's not going to protect them. And just today, this morning, the family packed what was left out of their belonging, force, literally, to flee from the houses which they lived for many, many, many years.
Could I just follow up on something you said, which I think people need to understand? You said the Israeli military is close by, but would not intervene to do anything. Is that a pattern? Is that typical? Or are there occasions when the military or the police do intervene and try to protect Palestinians?
This is undoubtedly a pattern. The objective is always the same, to basically ethnically cleanse bigger and bigger areas in the West Bank. We are talking about over 140 Palestinian communities and clusters which have been expelled in the last, I would say, 4 years now.
More than 140?
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, all these communities were not protected by the military, otherwise it wouldn't happen. Yeah, and this is how basically settlers are taking over huge swath of land in the West Bank by using violence. In best case, we're talking about verbal violence, but usually it's combined also with physical violence, which is meant to say, hey guys, this is what's going to happen to you unless you're going to leave the place.
And you told us about another Palestinian community that abandoned their houses just a few weeks ago.
Indeed, about 2.5 weeks ago, this community left, and I was there. You can see that people fled from these houses, leaving behind them, a lot of the property which they own,
such as
equipment, furniture. We're not talking about wealthy people. We're talking about very, very simple. Books, children books, kitchen equipment. Very, very basic, very, very simple everything. You could see that this is a very poor community. Yeah, a water tank was left there.
And Dror, where do they go? I mean, they're not leaving the West Bank, are they?
So it depends. It depends where they come from. If they are villagers, so usually they would go back to the main village, like the family from Ya'bed, which I mentioned before. So they would go to the next village where the relatives are. So it created also a lot of secondary shocks and crises within the Palestinian society.
Well, Dave, maybe it's time to introduce our guest more properly.
So just to get an idea of your background, Dror, you worked with Peace Now. Dror Etkes worked with Peace Now, which was an advocacy group trying to halt Jewish settlements for many decades. And then an Israeli group, Yesh Din, which means Volunteers for Human Rights. And now with a small NGO you founded called Kerem Navot. And you and your colleagues, all Israelis, I guess, just about all Israelis, right?
Palestinians as well, of course.
So you've been doing a lot of research, and you put out a report that looks at the impact of these attacks in the West Bank by settlers, and you have concluded that they've brought about profound changes in that area since Benjamin Netanyahu, came back to power as prime minister in 2022. Can you summarize those profound changes?
Yeah, so what we basically found is that the phenomena of expelling Palestinian communities, which started actually in 2022, had accelerated since Netanyahu came to power, and especially since October 7th.
This is October 7th, 2023, the attack by Hamas from Gaza.
CNN has gathered chilling new insights and details on the Hamas assault inside Israel, including disturbing video taken by the attackers themselves as they rampaged through Israeli homes, killing on sight.
This was an attack by Palestinians from Gaza associated with the Hamas terrorist organization, which swept through a kibbutz and a music festival, raping and slaughtering about 1,200 people and taking about 250 hostage. And this was a traumatic experience for Israel, for all of Israel, actually, which probably released an explosion of vengeance, or at least an atmosphere in which the Israeli settlers on the West Bank could take advantage of the possibility, the opportunity to attack innocent Palestinians who were miles away, nowhere near Gaza, had nothing to do with this attack, to drive them out of their villages and off their land.
And with the expulsion of these Palestinian communities, the settler has been able to expand the area which they control in the West Bank to, I assume, what we're looking at today at over 1 million dunam.
A dunam, by the way, is about 1/4 of an acre.
So doing quick math, you found that Israeli settlers have taken over roughly 250,000 acres of the West Bank, much of it in just the past few years.
Yep. So very, very big part of the West Bank, I would say around 20% of the West Bank today, is controlled by settlers who use violence in order to force Palestinians to leave the areas which they or live in or work in. So the phenomena of settlers' violence has incredible impact on the reality on the ground in terms of where Palestinians can be today.
Actually, you and your colleagues have used tools like drones and satellite photos to track how much land Israeli settlers have taken from Palestinians on the West Bank. And the before and after shots are striking. I mean, you can see huge swaths of land changing hands.
Right. This violence campaign is accelerating all the time. And while we're talking right now, it's accelerating as well. We're not talking about the past. We're talking about something which happens right now while we are talking.
In a moment, we want to get into the details of the strategy that the Jewish settlers are using, the Israeli settlers, with the government support. But before we get there, Dave, you're an expert on this. You used to be the New York Times correspondent in that region. Could you give us a thumbnail sketch of the West Bank? What does it all mean?
I'm not an expert in anything, but I was there for a long time, 5 years.
You're a co-host of Two Reporters podcast. Of course, you're an expert on many things.
Well, Dror can fill this in, but the West Bank means the West Bank of the Jordan River. It was, until 1967, the Six-Day War, under Jordanian control, along with Sinai under Egyptian control, Gaza also under Egyptian control, the Golan Heights under Syrian control. And during the 1967 war, Israel captured those territories. And the West Bank then had, only a Palestinian population. And now, over the time, and under both labor and more right-wing governments, Jewish settlements were permitted to be established in the West Bank.
And in the beginning, we're talking about very, very tiny, small communities. But up from the late 1970s and the early 1980s, Israel deliberately built settlements in the heart of the West Bank between Palestinian communities. And the idea behind that was very, very simple. With very few people, Israel can take over strategic points in the West Bank in order to create buffers, With settlement built in between the Palestinian communities in the heart of the West Bank, Israel will be able to dissect the West Bank in a way that there will be no future possibility to establish Palestinian state in the West Bank. So the settlement enterprise is an enterprise which, to begin with, meant to achieve one goal: to prevent any Palestinian political entity or anything similar to independence entity in the West Bank.
This really also closes off options for Israel. Yes, it closes options for the Palestinians, but it also makes it impossible for Israel to negotiate a two-state solution with any effectiveness. And so that option, that alternative to this current situation, becomes more and more difficult because of Israeli actions of its own making.
I mean, you are talking about, preventing Israel from reaching a two-state solution, but this is exactly what Israel wanted to prevent. Israel did not want a two-state solution. Israel wanted and thought, and many Israelis still think, I guess the majority of Israelis think, they can go on and controlling millions of Palestinians who are, and this is important to say, that the Palestinians of the West Bank are not citizens of the state of Israel, in a way. They are living under Israeli military control. Okay, so Israel, especially this government, more clear than ever before, basically the only option which they are offering the Palestinians is basically to live in an apartheid regime.
So you're saying Israel wants Palestinians on the West Bank to live under an apartheid regime?
This is what it is. This is basically what it is.
You and your colleagues have detailed a series of strategies that the Israeli settlers, with the government support, have been using in order to expel the Palestinians. I think a lot of people in the West, we have a sense that the attacks are kind of, sporadic. There's a violent attack here, there's a violent attack there. Some settlers are building some fences here, they're building a new road there. But you and your colleagues have shown that this is actually a very systematic strategy. The Israelis are building new roads on Palestinian land. Your recent report says that over the last few years, around 150 miles of new dirt roads have been opened across the West Bank and Palestinian areas. Then the Israeli settlers, with the military's help, set up what are called outposts. And you said in the last few years, 185 new outposts or more have been established in the West Bank. And what are those outposts?
In order to understand the strategy, we have, I think, to go one step backward in order to understand the principal problem of the Israeli settlement enterprise in the West Bank. And the principal problem is that the vast majority of the population of the West Bank is Palestinian, right? And the vast majority of the land is owned by Palestinians. So if you want control over this area, you basically have to find a way to compensate for the demographic inferiority. And the only way to do that is by engineering, if you wish. And this word here, engineering, is very important, because the settlement enterprise is an attempt to engineer the landscape in the West Bank, creating an artificial geographical supremacy, which compensates for the demography. Until today, around 3 million Palestinians are living in the West Bank, right? And if you want to basically control this area, you need to establish as many as possible of settlements or outposts or military bases or industrial zones or gas stations, or it doesn't really matter what, just spots on the map, of course, on the ground as well, which create an artificial engineered reality which serves the minority of the population, which the state of Israel is supporting in the West Bank. So in order to do that and to create the grid, you have, of course, also to open new roads over time. The roads which are serving only Israeli settlers, not all the roads in the West Bank, but these specific roads which you mentioned before, this 150 miles, we speak in kilometers, so we spoke about 211 kilometers of dirt road which were open. Yeah? They're used only by settlers. Palestinians cannot use them. Now, not only that they're used only by settlers, they are also deliberately dissecting Palestinian communities from each other, or cutting the ability of Palestinians to reach agricultural or grazing land. This is how you do it.
And along many, many, many miles of these roads, the Israelis are building fences, and they're putting gates. I've seen pictures of them in your report. They look like you're crossing an international frontier. Gates that only Israelis can pass. Palestinians are not welcome.
Gates, it can be sometimes rocks, which are blocking access to Palestinian communities, so people cannot reach their houses, they cannot reach entire areas, so they cannot cultivate them, they cannot graze them. And I just want to go one step backward, with your permission, and speak about the term outpost. Outpost is actually an Israeli settlement. It's actually a smaller Israeli settlement, but it's also illegal according to the Israeli law. So we know that all Israeli settlement activity in West Bank is illegal according to the international law, because the West Bank is not part of the state of Israel, because the West Bank is an occupied area, and according to the Fourth Geneva Convention, the occupying power is not allowed to move population into the occupied area.
And Dror, can you describe the outposts? Are they like house trailers or what?
So the term outpost came to the world somewhere around the mid-90s. Why outposts? Because they were not official settlements. The classic outpost would be a hilltop, sometimes a few hundred meters away from an existing settlement, sometimes a few kilometers away from an existing settlement. And in order to reach this hilltop, the first thing which you have to do is to open a road. And then once you have a road, you flatten an area and you bring a mobile home and you put in the top of a hill, and then you bring another mobile home and another one, and you connect these mobile homes to the water grid with a tube, and you connect them to electricity, maybe by a generator or maybe by a cable which you drove from the nearby settlement or road or bypass road, whatever. And this is how you basically expand the area which the settlers control. Okay. Now, these are the old type of outposts. About 10 years ago, we started to see a new type of outpost, and this is the herding outpost.
Herding outposts.
In each one of these outposts, there is a herd of cattle or sheep or goats. These outposts are meant, of course, to achieve the same goal, which is maximum land with no Palestinians on it, right? But the way they have done it was way more aggressive and way, way more effective. We're looking at much less people who move to each one of these outposts with much more ammunition and with much more weapons and with much more, I would say, support of the Israeli military. When we speak about settlers' violence in West Bank in the last years, this phenomena is very strongly connected to these herding outposts or grazing outposts.
I think that we need to remind everybody that we're talking with Dror Etkes. He's co-founder of the group Kerem Navot, who's been telling the world about Jewish settlers' campaign and the Israeli government's campaign to drive Palestinians out of their villages in the West Bank.
Right. So when we speak about violence, we're not talking only about physical violence, not only about threats. We're talking about vandalizing equipment, making the life of people who are still there impossible.
The Israeli settlers are cutting off the Palestinian farmers' water supply, destroying their water pipes. They're planting a lot of this Palestinian land in Israeli olive groves and vineyards to make wine.
So just imagine that you have a community which is completely dependent on bringing water from a few kilometers away, because the Palestinian herding communities are not connected to the water system, to the water grid, right? So they are completely dependent on open roads in order to bring every day, sometimes several times a day, especially in the summer, water to the livestock or to the families, or to bring kids to school, or to go shopping, or to bring to go to the doctor, whatever, people need. And during these trips, people are extremely vulnerable and they are being attacked while traveling, or even worse, in their homes. And that brings me, that reminds me what I heard once from the first Palestinian community which was expelled back there in July 2022. The name of the community is Ras Atin. I knew this community for a few years. And an outpost was established there around 2019. And this outpost is a very, very aggressive one. And for several years, the attacks against this community, the attacks against them were outside in the meadow only in the mountain. Yeah. But in some point, the settlers with soldiers attacked the men of the community in front of their children and their wives. Yeah. I remember the person, his name is Omar, who told me, as long as we were attacked outside in the meadows and the mountain, when we were herding, it was one thing. It was something which we learned somehow, to survive it. But once we were attacked in front of our kids in our house, this is something which we couldn't cope with, something which we had to leave the place.
And this, of course, is humiliating, deeply robbing of people's dignity to have that happen in front of their families. And Dror, how did you get to this point? Where did you come from politically, emotionally, to arrive at the position that you're in as a monitor of the atrocities, you can say, that are going on in the West Bank and of Israeli behavior? What happened in your life to lead you to this?
I know that there were a number of factors, but you told us in a previous phone call that one of the big impacts on you was your service in the military when you were a young man, and what you saw and what you did.
That's true. That's true. So, first of all, I was born in Jerusalem, and I grew up in East Jerusalem, surrounded by Palestinian neighborhoods around us. So, my very upbringing was kind of, I experienced the settlers' experience in my own childhood, growing up in a neighborhood which was surrounded by Palestinian communities. So that was, I think, to be a good start in in the explanation how I reached the point that I am already. I just grew up into this conflict, and of course the conflict was very much milder back then. It was way less violent than what it became later, and it was very natural also for me, therefore, to be drafted to the military back then when I was 18. And not only to be drafted to the military, also to wish to be in a combat unit and so on,
You were what we would call gung-ho, that is, eager to fight, eager to be on the front lines? Or?
No, whether I was eager to fight, but I think that the way I understood Israeli masculinity back then was very much connected to militarism, to how I understood what Israeli man had to do. Was very strongly connected, to be a soldier and to be in the Israeli military and so on. Yeah, and I was drafted in 1986, in November 1986, and about a year later, the first Intifada erupted in December 87. And I was one of these Israeli soldiers who were sent to oppress the Palestinian Intifada, the first Intifada. I was there in the West Bank. And I've not only seen it, I also participated in it. I also participated in the oppression of this intifada.
Meaning what? What did you do?
The routine back then was, to walk in a Palestinian village or a Palestinian town. We were equipped with clubs. So we had guns and clubs, and back then, there was a famous say of Rabin, who was the Minister of Defense back then, say, break their bones. So the idea was, don't kill them, just break their bones, Breaking the bones was the way Israel chose to oppress a Palestinian upbringing. And that was 20 years into the Israeli occupation back then, And I was there. And I had a club, and I had a gun, and I would walk somewhere, and suddenly, young Palestinians more or less in our age, or even younger sometimes, would throw stones on us, and then we start running after them. And in most cases, of course, they were much quicker because they were, lighter, and they knew the area way better than we did. But sometimes, you walk into a Palestinian house, and you get someone, you drag a guy, out of the kitchen, you drag a guy, under the bed, and then you're surrounded by his family, by his wife, by his sisters, by his mom. And you are exposed to the way people are living. You see Palestinian houses, and you see how people live. We're talking in most cases, about people who have a very, very hard life. Let's put it this way, In some cases, another classic mission would be to go in the middle of the night to raid a Palestinian village in the middle of the night with a Shin Bet person.
That's the internal security police,
right? And with a Palestinian informer, who we couldn't see ourselves as well, because he was hidden with a bag, kind of a canvas bag on his face, and with two holes here, so no one can recognize him, including us. And he would go from one house to the other with a Shin Bet agent, and with soldiers, and we were supposed to take people out of the bed or out of the mattresses in most cases, barefoot in many cases, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a winter. Of a West Bank winter, which can be pretty cold, and to take them to buses, and then to handcuff them. And you can imagine what can happen in these type of places. You're always going to have the people who enjoy hurting others. They're not the majority, but they will always be there. Will always be people who enjoy hurting other people, and that was the best and the most formative political school I ever had in my life.
Did you break bones?
No, I didn't. No, what I realized about myself is that I don't enjoy hurting people. I don't like hurting people. No, that it's not something which I like to do. And I was participating, and at the same time, I was looking at myself from outside and saying to myself, this is state terror. What I'm doing right now, I'm terrorizing population. I happen to be sent by my own society to terrorize civil population, which is under military control. And this is what we're doing here.
And Dror, just to insert, who were these detainees in your understanding? Did you think that they were suspected members of terrorist organizations, or what?
Of course not. They were all suspected in throwing stones and things like that. In some cases, we're talking about 10 years old kids, 11 years old kids, 14 years old kids, So you understand that they're not the terrorists that you're looking for, right? And you understand what you're doing there. Of course you understand. And of course, look, I don't want to romanticize it. I don't want to describe myself better than what I was. No, I was part of it. I was part of it. And at the same time, I can say that until today, I had no other better political lessons than this one, than this period in my life. Understanding what can happen to people, how societies can indoctrinate people, how societies can use their own people, including myself. And I'm sure I wouldn't be who I am, and I wouldn't do what I'm doing without these years as a soldier in the West Bank.
And we know you got another kind of political education when you spent years traveling in Europe and the United States, and you spent a few years in Latin America, where the U.S. government had a long history of overthrowing leaders they did not like and installing dictators that they did. Then you went back to Israel.
And you studied Arabic. You went on to learn Arabic, right?
Yeah, I took it seriously and I learned Arabic, and yeah. Arabic is a main tool in my work. I'm communicating with people, in Arabic. This is the language of the vast majority of the population of West Bank, but it's more than that. It's also an attempt to build an alternative Israeli identity. Israeli identity which is in communication with the area around us, with the environment around us, with the people around us. Learning the language is not only a tool, for technical communication. It's way more than that, especially in the context of conflict. When you learn the language of your enemy, or when you learn the language of a person who is, which you are basically occupying, right? I think you are also conveying a message of respect. It can be seen also very different. It can be also a measure of control, right? Who speaks Arabic in Israel? Most of the people who speak Arabic well, are people who come from intelligence, right? Intelligent background. So this is also something which I always have to deal with, Palestinians who ask me, how come you speak Arabic? And, the subtext of the question is, well, are you intelligent? Are you Shin Bet, right?
And what percentage of Israelis speak Arabic fluently, as you do?
Tiny. And this is a tragedy, yeah. And yeah, this is a very unfortunate situation, because bilingual gaps are, of course, contributing also to the animosity and to the hatred and so on.
And language, of course, is a window into culture. Are you at risk, Dror? I mean, you're a very public person. You're very visible. Do you find yourself in danger at all as you go about this work?
I'm not keen to speak about myself, to be honest, but if you ask, being outside in the West Bank today can be...
I'm going to interject. You told me once that you have received death threats from Israelis.
Yeah, I mean, look, if I'm honest, I'm exposed to a certain danger from both sides, from Israelis who know who I am and from Palestinians who don't know who I am, right?
And are you known to settlers as a gadfly, a monitor, or somebody they really have reason not to like particularly?
I assume that I am, yeah. Yeah.
Have you been targeted at all?
Next question.
So let's sum it all up. The Israeli government says that roughly, a little over 500,000 Israeli settlers have moved into the West Bank, compared to roughly 3 million Palestinians.
And that doesn't include the 250,000 Israelis who live in East Jerusalem, which was part of the West Bank that was annexed by Israel after the 1967 war.
And I take it that the Israeli settlers who've moved to the West Bank are driven by a variety of motives, right?
Yes, there is a group of what we could call religio-nationalist settlers who believe that the West Bank, which they called Judea and Samaria, its biblical names, was given by God to the Jews through the prophet Abraham. They've been the ideological movers of settlements. But then there are many others who moved there because they got low-cost loans for housing. They liked living out in the country. They could commute easily into Israel proper. And then there are more recently Haredim, that is the black-coated ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are there also for religious reasons. So there's a variety of motives.
But it's important to remember that also people who moved there because of so-called ideological reasons, they also enjoyed the economical incentive. And also people who moved there mainly because of the incentives, of the economical incentives, also, are leaning to the right or very much supporting the right, okay? And when we look at today West Bank, I would say it's almost irrelevant what is the reason that brought you. We're looking at 500,000 plus 300,000 in East Jerusalem, which are there. And this is something which Israel had created in order to prevent any possibility that the Palestinian would have any kind of a national statehood in this country.
Okay, what proportion of the settlers would you say are actively terrorizing Palestinians?
100%.
Well, not 100% go into the villages.
No, 100%. It's important to say 100% because there is no single Israeli settlement which exists for 1 second without using violence. Only because of violence. Okay, this is very, very important to remember. But also the so-called, moderate settlement, or the settlements which are economically or inhabited by mainly economical settlers, they're also established on land which had been taken by violence from a Palestinian community, and they are there only because the military is operating there, and not only the military, also the entire Israeli security organs, including the police, including the Shin Bet, everybody, in order to facilitate the system. It would be way too easy for us, to speak about the violent settlers, to speak about the problem with the violent settlers. It's not a problem with the violent settlers. It's a problem. The problem is the state of Israel.
I guess I'm curious because you agreed that many settlers moved to the West Bank because of cheap housing and so forth. Whether any of them, if there's any evidence that they oppose the violence and the vigilantism of these settlers who are going into Palestinian villages. Is there any counter movement, any criticism of this kind of tactic among the Jewish settlers that you know of?
Extremely marginal, and with zero impact on the reality on the ground. So yeah, there are some Israeli settlers. I have several people who I know personally, and I very much appreciate them for that, who are standing against their neighbors, and this is hard. It's much easier for me, to speak about it, from where I live. I don't have to deal with my neighbors. But these are people who do every day when they open their door, they have to deal with the neighbors who are supporting it. Yeah, this is a hard position to be in. So there are, but they're very, 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 very few. Again, I don't like to put the blame on the Israeli settlers because this is a state project. This is the biggest and the most complicated and the most expensive project with the state of Israel ever carried out.
And that raises a question that the United States tends to think it has a lot more influence globally than it really does. I mean, we've just seen this in Iran. And over the years, through almost every administration except the Trump administration, both Republican and Democratic presidents have denounced settlements as, quote, obstacles to peace. But they haven't actually put any sanctions to speak of on Israel for continuing to build the settlements. Recently, Rahm Emanuel, former mayor of Chicago, former chief of staff to Barack Obama, and probably a presidential candidate in 2028, gave a blistering speech in Tel Aviv in which he denounced both the Greater Israel idea and the idea of Palestinian freedom from the river to the sea, which implies for some people the elimination of Israel.
Is at a crossroads. It cannot stand or survive as it has been. Unconditional support has allowed you to deny food and medical relief to innocent Palestinians in Gaza, leaving the world to conclude that Israelis not only want to kill Palestinians, but they are completely indifferent to their death, to their destruction, and completely indifferent to their suffering.
So I'm just wondering what your view is on the role of the United States and the rest of the international community, if anything, in addressing this terrible situation that's been going on now. Mostly the world has been standing by and watching and wringing its hands at the most. Is there a possibility that the United States, for example, could actually influence Israeli policy on this?
First of all, I don't like this question.
That's why I asked it, Dror. I love to ask questions people don't like.
I'll tell you why I don't like this question, but I will answer. I won't run away. Don't worry. I don't like this question because this question is assuming that Israel is, that we're children who cannot take care of our own interests, that, we need Uncle Sam, to come to tell us what is good for us. And I don't like to give the Israeli public any discounts. We have to understand that this is what Israel is. I mean, I don't like to say it, but Israel exists, less than 80 years. And out of his 80 years, 58 years or 59 years, Israel is running an occupation / apartheid system in the West Bank. This is a collective decision which was made once and again by all Israeli governments which were democratically elected in Israel since 1967. Yeah, United States and the EU in many ways were obviously always a much bigger part of the problem than the solution. The relationship with the United States and then with the West, yeah, this is what enabled Israel to continue to do that. And yes, if tomorrow there would be an American president who would decide that Israel will have to choose between settlements or support of the United States or whatever, yeah, there are very, very good reasons to assume that Israel's decision would be very different. But again, the settlement enterprise and the catastrophe which we're living here is a collective decision which was made once and again by the Israeli public in the last 60 years almost.
Dror Etkes, what do you think, what do you see unfolding over the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Catastrophe. I don't know where and when it will erupt, but I say catastrophe.
When you say erupt, I'm obviously making predictions in that part of the world are for only fools and prophets, but do you see a potential for an uprising, another intifada by the Palestinians in the face of these vigilante attacks by settlers?
I don't see a scenario that it won't erupt. Now, I don't know exactly when and where, but I know the type of reality which Israel tried to preserve in the West Bank is unpreservable. It's a reality which trigger always more and more and more violence.
Dror Etkes is co-founder of the research group Kerem Navot in Israel. You and your colleagues document how Israeli settlers have been attacking Palestinians and expelling them from their land in the West Bank. Thank you so much, as depressing as this has been.
Thank you for hosting me today.
Thank you, Dror, for your work. It's important. Thanks very much.
I would like to end this conversation with a more optimistic estimate of the future, but this is not where we are right now.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Tripler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.